Welcome to The Economist's Climate Risk North America virtual event. Before we dive deep into the opening keynote session with John Morton, I wanted to thank all the sponsors for their valuable contributions and for supporting this event. Our silver sponsors, FM Global, Jupiter, and Clarity AI. Our ESG reporting sponsor, OneTrust ESG. Thanks again. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our opening keynote fireside chat, building on and accelerating existing efforts on climate change. I'm Vijay Vaitiswaran. I'm the Global Energy and Climate Innovation Editor at The Economist, and I'm delighted to welcome on our stage John Morton, Climate Counselor at the United States Department of Treasury. Now, a recent important report put forward by the Financial Stability Oversight Council, which is chaired by America's Treasury Secretary, argued that climate change is an emerging threat to the stability of the U.S. financial system and had a number of recommendations. I wanted to dig into some of the thinking at the U.S. Treasury and the U.S. government more broadly on this question. And for that, we're very lucky to have John Morton with us. John, thank you for joining us. Please give us a sense of how the Treasury is taking on climate change.
Great. Thanks, Vijay, and thanks to The Economist for the opportunity to be with you today. I think I will start by saying, by reiterating the belief of this administration and certainly the Treasury Department, but the broader U.S. administration right now, which is that the transition to a low carbon and ultimately net zero global economy represents among the most predictable and consequential economic transformations, arguably in modern history. And so while climate change poses a threat, and as you said, the FSOC, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, in this conversation, found climate change to represent an emerging and increasing threat to the financial stability of the United States government. At the same time, we recognize that this threat represents an unprecedented economic opportunity for businesses, industries, and countries that position themselves to lead the transition to a low carbon and ultimately net zero economy. And so the entire U.S. government, including centrally the Treasury Department, is focused on how do we reorient our posture from one that thinks of climate change exclusively as an existential threat and a threat to financial stability, but towards a job creation opportunity, toward a wealth creation opportunity, toward an innovation opportunity and agenda. And I think that's what you really have seen in the first year of this administration is entity by entity, agency, department by department, us using the tools and the resources that we have at our disposal to treat this threat, and a threat it certainly is, and a growing threat it is, also as an opportunity to retool our economy and to retool our policies. And so whether that's the bipartisan infrastructure bill that became law, or whether it's the Build Back Better framework that we are continuing to work with Congress on getting passed, these policies and legislative and executive actions that we have taken represent historically large commitments to taking a threat and repurposing it toward an unprecedented economic opportunity. So that's the way that we're thinking about climate change, and using, frankly, all the tools at our disposal to tackle this challenge. At Treasury, that involves budget policy, it involves tax policy, it involves regulatory and oversight work that we do via the Financial Stability Oversight Council, and importantly, it also includes our work via the international development finance institutions, the multilateral development banks, the Green Climate Fund, because Treasury represents the U.S. government as the voice and the vote of the U.S. government in each of those large multilateral or regional development banks. So we're really quite active and have had an extraordinarily active first year in reorienting our posture toward this existential challenge and unprecedented economic opportunity.
Great. So, John, that's an excellent setting of the stage. I'm a big fan of jiu-jitsu. I'm pleased to know that this has been taken up at the highest levels of the U.S. government to turn adversity into opportunity. Let's hope that works out. I do want to drill down a little bit. You covered the waterfront in terms of the kinds of things that Treasury now is attempting to do. Some of them were international. Let's put a pin in that for the moment. Let's look at the things that are happening on the home front. Can you talk about some specific examples that we can expect the U.S. Treasury to pursue related to domestic actions that would somehow, let's start with the risk side of things, help cope with the risks of climate change, whether it's coordination with some of the bank regulatory agencies or the SEC on disclosure, or some of the other things that you could point your finger at. What can we expect on the domestic front?
Well, let me start because you started on the kind of regulatory and SEC front to say, first and foremost, it's important to understand that Treasury is not a regulator. We are not an independent regulator. The U.S. government has a host of, or the U.S. system has a host of regulators, whether the alphabet soup of regulators, the FDIC, the Fed, the SEC, the CFTC, the OCC, all of whom play a differentiated and important role in the overall financial regulatory landscape. Importantly, Secretary Yellen chairs what's called the Financial Stability Oversight Council. And in her role as chair, she can help set agendas for how those independent regulators tackle, address, and pay attention to key issues of particular concern to financial stability. When Secretary Yellen was confirmed, one of the first things she did was convene the FSOC, and in that role as chair, the first agenda item was climate change. So the regulators who were already beginning to treat climate change as an emerging systemic risk now are doing so, I would say, in a much more coordinated fashion. And in a very important report, historically important report on financial risk that came out in October, there were 30-some-odd recommendations that the FSOC made back to the member entities, these independent regulators, regarding actions or pathways for those institutions to consider as they begin to further mainstream climate risk into their operations. And those work streams, I should say, are all active and underway right now. And I think we should expect over the course of 2022, the independent regulators to make a series of very important, high-profile announcements related to how they are continuing to mainstream climate risk into their operations. And some of the initial rules that we expect to begin seeing very shortly will begin coming out, I think, over the course of 2022. So again, Treasury doesn't dictate to the independent regulators, but does help set an agenda and has already very effectively, I think, elevated climate-related financial risk within the agenda, the shared agenda of the financial regulators. That's, I would say, number one, and arguably among the more important levers that we have exercised.
So this coordinating function, as you rightly say, the secretary is the chair of that effort, the council. So it's really the coordination and the setting of priorities. We've heard terms like all of government response to climate change as it's being taken on by the Biden administration. So we're getting a sense of that coordinating function and some action to come from the different agencies. Continue on. You were going to say the next point in your
I was going to say, you asked me to stay on the you asked me to stay on the domestic front.
So on the domestic front.
Yeah, on the domestic front for now, our tax capabilities within Treasury are key to designing the types of incentives that we believe will effectively and efficiently position the U.S. economy to transition to a cleaner, lower carbon, and ultimately net zero economy. So we're spending a lot of time working across the interagency with the White House and particularly with Congress in helping right now to hopefully design a package that can get 50 votes in the Build Back Better world. And frankly, whether that bill looks like what was originally proposed by the president or something that is a bit more modest, we believe, and we have every reason to believe, that the combined incentives that will be part of that ultimate package will again be, many times larger than any other previous piece of legislation, particularly as it relates to climate action. So we are realistic, but optimistic about the impact that these coming incentives will have in terms of spurring job growth and job creation in key sectors of the economy that we think are critical to America's future competitiveness.
Great. So that gives a sense of what's happening within the U.S. I do want to look at what's happening overseas as well. One area that I'd like to use as the pivot to get there, efforts in other parts of the world, notably Europe, have been advancing. Sometimes the choices being made in the UK or in Brussels are not exactly the same as the choices that are either being made or contemplated in Washington. Can you tell us, how do you think about the role of coordination on the kinds of things that you work on at the Treasury, and what you see either from global bodies or standards efforts like those led by Mark Carney and others? What's the key here to avoid having a balkanization of global financial markets, for example, with which may impede that progress towards net zero or create unworkable red tape for banks and other institutions?
Yeah, Vijay, maybe 3 points. First is we recognize, and I mean that to the core, we recognize that strong and consistent and reliable market signals are what are needed, and that a proliferation of discordant regulatory signals is not the most effective way of enabling and expediting a net zero market transition, which again is our kind of North Star here. So we are very, very focused on that point. The second thing I would say is, to that extent, we also recognize that the word harmonization can be an attractive but sometimes dangerous word, because it implies that there might be a one size fits all across jurisdictions which operate under very different political constraints. And so we tend to use the word interoperable in our internal language. We're looking for systems and regimes around disclosure and around standards that are interoperable, not necessarily globally harmonized. And we think that's both more realistic to expect from a political economy standpoint, and frankly, if the end result that we're striving for are emissions reductions, we honestly feel that there are many different ways and many different regulatory and policy regimes to that can deliver similarly ambitious emissions reductions results. So interoperability is the key word that we are focused on for this year as we seek to align evolving European standards with domestic standards, emerging domestic standards. And then finally, I think I'd just say something that perhaps we will hit on later in the conversation. But 2021 was really a year of commitments. It was an extraordinary year for commitments on the corporate side, on the financial market side, from a net zero commitment standpoint, and from the government side. We now have close to 90% of global GDP that has made some form of net zero commitment by mid-century or shortly thereafter. That's actually quite extraordinary if you think about it. This year has to be the year that we take those commitments and pivot to accountability and accountability and action. And so again, as we think about what our activities are focused on this year, it's really focused on interoperability of standards and regimes and action on net zero commitments. So
you had mentioned this striking figure, something like 90% of global GDP is now covered by some form of net zero targets. I have to point out, though, that on the latest figures I've seen, only about 20% of global GDP is covered by some form of carbon price, however low or high, and usually it's very low. Since you're a man at the Treasury looking after climate change, I think it's only fair to put this politically complicated question to you. What is the Treasury doing about carbon pricing? Can it do anything given the political realities of the U.S. Congress?
Well, I think that's it. So it's a great question, and it's a fair question, and it's certainly one one to be expected in any conversation like this. This is why I come back to this earlier notion of interoperable as opposed to a harmonized concept. We clearly, every political entity in the world operates under slightly different political constraints. I think I don't need to speak in tongues to say that we are we operate under a certain political reality in the U.S. right now, in which carbon pricing is a extremely difficult thing to imagine, at least in the near term. However, the U.S. has been extraordinarily successful at reducing its emissions over the last, let's say, decade, and we have every reason to believe that the NDC, the nationally determined contribution that the U.S. put forward last year of reducing its emissions by 50% to 52% by 2030, is very achievable if we put in place the policies, the combined policies that we have proposed in the Build Back Better framework, as well as the infrastructure bill. And so we are focused on using the tools that we think are achievable and reliable within the U.S. context to achieve meaningful greenhouse gas emissions. So I think that the notion of pricing, I think, is one that will will become increasingly salient in the years ahead. But at the moment, we are proceeding on other paths to achieve similarly ambitious goals, and our record so far has been pretty good on that front. I would point
out. Thank you. Yes, I know that was a tricky question for you, but you handled it with aplomb, I would say. I must say, for the record, The Economist has long argued for carbon pricing. I think I wrote my first leader on this topic, advocating revenue-neutral carbon taxes 20 years ago. We've yet to see them, at least in the U.S., but we will continue to bang the drum, at least in our shop. You had mentioned in passing some other aspects of international policy, I think maybe referencing some of the financing of projects overseas, over which Treasury may have some direction. Can you talk a little bit about divesting from coal, for example, and moving away from other forms of fossil fuels? What's the Treasury's current position, and what can we anticipate in future?
Sure, and Vijay, if I may just make one more comment on the pricing issue, because I think it's important. What we have seen over the last year, arguably one of the more important developments of the last year from a market signaling standpoint, have been commitments coming out of the European Union and Canada and other places, who are beginning to talk about carbon border adjustments, right? The notion that the carbon intensity of the product that you are seeking to sell into another market will become a liability, or at least a factor in the price of that product sold into a market. And the specter of high carbon intensity products being charged more to be able to access large markets like the European Union is no longer a thing of science fiction or 10 years forward. Right. We're talking about within the next 2 to 3 years. That is a forcing function, I think, for very serious conversations within the U.S. government and within Congress about how do we, what is the appropriate reaction to those coming policies. And I think that will have a catalytic. Now,
will the U.S. implement a similar system, do you think? Would the U.S. implement a similar CBAM, as it's called?
The president has made clear that he believes that it is a tool that should be on the table in order to level the playing field and create a level playing field for the fair and equitable trade of products around the world. So at the moment, I can't speak to whether or not there's proposals, but Congress has certainly been there's been parts of Congress that have been discussing these matters. And we have a joint agreement with the European Union now on steel that has recently been reached that seeks to head off, frankly, trade disputes and reach common cause on how do we establish high quality, low emitting standards for steel. And I think that's an approach that we may see grow into other sectors as well. But I digress. I'll come back to your question on the international front right now.
Please, we just have a minute, so perhaps briefly.
Yeah, sure. I think there's 3 things we need to do on international climate finance. The first is we need to finance less brown industry. So that means phasing out public support for coal, certainly, oil and gas, as quickly as possible. And that's something we've really focused quite a bit on in this administration. The second is we need to significantly increase our finance for green solutions, whether it's energy, transportation, low-emitting infrastructure, et cetera. We're really pushing on the multilateral development banks to do more green finance, more climate finance. And the third, very exciting new area is we need to figure out how to finance the expedited closure of high-emitting assets around the world, in particular coal-fired power plants in high-emitting middle-income countries. We had a landmark deal with South Africa signed during COP to do just that. And I think one of the things we'll be looking forward to in this year is how do we strike similar deals with large, high-emitting middle-income countries, perhaps in Asia, to begin helping support the closure, the expedited closure of high-emitting assets in countries. So those are three areas that we're really focused on in our international development finance policy.
That's great, John. You've given us a good insight into the range of things that Treasury is doing. We've just run out of time, so I'm going to leave it there. With much gratitude to you for joining our Economist event, and also to thank our audience for joining us for this particular session. Please stay tuned for our next session. Be about to start imminently.